Close your eyes and picture the Middle Ages. Mud, filth, fear, ignorance, a world where no one bathed, the earth was flat, and death was always just around the corner. Now open them again, because almost everything you just imagined is a lie. Hi, my name is Sam, and welcome to Eyes Shut History. Before we dive into this myth-busting episode, I would like to ask you to subscribe and comment if you like these stories. It really helps me out to write more stories for you guys. Now sit back, relax, and let your eyes shut to history. And so, we walk now into that world. We walk to bust the myths, one after another, to let the truth breathe through the smoke of stories told too many times. The Middle Ages deserve not the sneer of darkness, but the gaze of curiosity. For in the shadows of the myths, the reality glimmers, waiting to be seen. Start with the smell. The easy myth is that nobody bathed, that people carried their own weather around them and were proud of it. Yet in towns from London to Lubeck, bathhouses steamed like winter ponds, timber rooms hung with fresh boughs where water was perfumed with rosemary or mint. On fast days and feast days, after market and before Mass, people undressed and sat in warm wooden tubs, while friends talked and deals were made. In castles, tubs were dragged to hearths, lined with linen and filled by servants heaving pails from copper kettles. In monasteries, the infirmarian kept a bath schedule as carefully as he kept his psalter. Soap, harsh, yes, but real, was rendered from fat and ash in cottages that smelled like a cross between a kitchen and a witch's pantry. Not everyone could afford wood for an indulgent soak in January, and not every village stream ran sweet in August. But the medieval nose recognized the difference between sweat and neglect. Cleanliness was a virtue. The sermon just phrased it as godliness. Tilt your head up to the sky. Another myth insists medieval people feared a cliff at the world's edge. But monks copied Bede explaining the globe. Students in Paris traced Aristotle's reasoning. Sailors watched masts sink below the horizon and shrugged. The earth's roundness was old news written in new hands. Ships wrecked on shoals, not on space's lip. The abyss the chroniclers feared was moral, not cartographic. Sit at the high table and taste the next misunderstanding. Spices, we are told, were medieval deodorant for rotten meat. Imagine paying a year's wages for pepper to rescue a stinking haunch. You might as well gild a corpse. Meat was salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. It was too dear to waste on obliviousness. Spices did a different kind of flaunting. Saffron lit broths like sunrise. Cinnamon and ginger warmed stews in a climate that remembered ice. A dish glittering with imported flavor said, "Look how far my merchants sail, look what my purse can reach." As for the poor, no, they did not drown in rotten fare. They lived on bread dark with rye, on bread dark with rye, on pottage that simmered for hours over a smoky fire, thick with cabbage, beans, or leeks, depending on the season. Cheese was a treasure that lasted through the hungry months, and ale, always ale, kept thirst at bay when water could not be trusted. It was a diet plain by our standards, repetitive and humble, but it was food meant to fill bellies and fuel muscles hardened by work. There were feasts, too, even in poor cottages, weddings, harvests, holy days, when a pig was slaughtered and every scrap of it savored from snout to tail. The idea that medieval people constantly gagged down spoiled food is a myth that tells us more about modern arrogance than about their tables. And then there are the castles, imagined by us as grey prisons, empty but for draughty corridors and dripping stones. Step through a real medieval hall and you find colour, walls whitewashed until they shone in the torchlight, then painted with patterns or saints in vivid reds and blues. Tapestries hung heavy, not just to tell stories but to keep out the chill. Floors spread with rushes sweetened with lavender, daisies, or rosemary, replaced often enough that guests did not sink ankle-deep into filth, as Victorian writers loved to claim. Even peasants' houses, though smoky and cramped, bore carvings on furniture, bright chests for linen, garlands pinned for feast days. The myth of a grey and joyless age dissolves under the reality of paint and fabric, under the sound of music bouncing in rafters where swallows nested. Education is another shadow. We imagine that only a handful of monks could read, while the rest of Europe stumbled blindly in ignorance. Yet parish records tell us something quieter. Many peasants could sign their names. Town guilds kept books, merchants balanced ledgers, wives of tradesmen wrote letters in careful hands. Not everyone read Latin, no, but literacy in the vernacular grew century by century, as practical as it was precious. Schools multiplied. Universities in Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and Prague drew students from across Christendom. They debated Aristotle, pored over Avicenna, learned law, music, and astronomy. A medieval village might indeed contain those who never held a book, but it also contained boys reciting their psalms, scribes hunched over parchment, and girls tracing letters on slate. Darkness did not blot out learning. It flickered like a candle that refused to go out. And superstition, here the myth insists, lies the heart of the Middle Ages. People trembling at eclipses, terrified of comets, cowed into obedience by priests with relics. There is truth, yes. The night sky spoke loudly to a society without gaslight. But to say they were ruled only by fear is to miss the complexity of belief. Medieval people read signs in the heavens and in the earth, yes, but they also experimented. They planted by the moon and tested soil. They charted stars and debated medicine. They made charms against sickness, but also brewed syrups of honey and thyme. To them, the world was not divided into science and superstition as we divide it. It was a seamless fabric, where prayer and poultice, star and scripture existed together without contradiction. And what of women? The myth often says they had no place, no power, no voice. Yet the records speak otherwise, if you look. A widow might inherit her husband's workshop and keep it running. Noble women managed estates, signed charters, and sometimes commanded castles under siege. Abbesses ruled convents like queens, advising kings who knelt for their counsel. Midwives were trusted in the most vulnerable hours of life and death. The law was not kind, the church not equal, and yet within those constraints women acted, shaped, and resisted. Their lives were not silence, but sound, muffled by the centuries. Even torture and punishment, painted in our imagination as daily spectacles of fire and wheel, were rarer than the myths suggest. Executions happened, yes, and could be brutal, but justice also meant fines, penance, or public shaming. The stocks were uncomfortable, humiliating, but less fatal than the gallows. Most disputes were settled in courts, in words, in coins exchanged. To imagine the Middle Ages as one long parade of torture devices is to confuse reality with the morbid sketches of later centuries. These myths persist because they are simple, and simple stories are easier to repeat. A dark age, an ignorant people, a world of mud and misery. It is a neat picture, but it is not the truth. The truth is messier, brighter, stranger. It is a mother bathing her child in a wooden tub while rosemary floats on the water. It is a scholar in Paris, ink staining his fingers, arguing about the orbit of the planets. It is a peasant carving a design into his bedpost, leaving behind an art unrecorded in chronicles but real in wood. It is laughter in taverns. It is prayers in chapels. It is the ordinary human stubbornness to find beauty, even in hardship. The Middle Ages were not dark. They were lit by fire, by candle, by color, by song, and the myths we carry, that they were filthy, ignorant, joyless, brutal, are shadows cast not by the people of that time, but by our own need to imagine the past as worse than the present. And then we come to the plague, that great spectre looming over the Middle Ages in our imagination. We see it as the Black Death that turned Europe into a charnel house, carts piled with bodies, priests walking with bells and masks shaped like monstrous birds. That much is true. Plague came, and it killed without mercy, and the memory of it never faded from those who lived through it. But the myth that the plague was endless, that medieval life was nothing but death, is not true. The Black Death struck in the mid-14th century, devastating, yes. But people survived, rebuilt, and lived on. Villages emptied, fields fell silent, yet in time voices returned. Children were born, songs were sung, and the fields were ploughed again. The plague was not the constant drumbeat of the Middle Ages. It was a catastrophe, terrible but temporary, and people carried on with resilience that we forget when we reduce centuries of life to one disease. The Middle Ages were not dark. They were lit by fire, by candle, by color, by song, and the myths we carry, that they were filthy, ignorant, joyless, brutal, are shadows cast not by the people of that time, but by our own need to imagine the past as worse than the present. And then we come to the plague, that great spectre looming over the Middle Ages in our imagination. We see it as the Black Death that turned Europe into a charnel house, carts piled with bodies, priests walking with bells and masks shaped like monstrous birds. That much is true. Plague came, and it killed without mercy, and the memory of it never faded from those who lived through it. But the myth that the plague was endless, that medieval life was nothing but death, is not true. The Black Death struck in the mid-14th century, devastating, yes. But people survived, rebuilt, and lived on. Villages emptied, fields fell silent, yet in time voices returned. Children were born, songs were sung, and the fields were ploughed again. The plague was not the constant drumbeat of the Middle Ages. It was a catastrophe, terrible but temporary, and people carried on with resilience that we forget when we reduce centuries of life to one disease. Peasants, too, suffer from myth. We picture them as slaves chained to the soil, hopeless, miserable, bowed under the weight of tyranny. But peasants were not without agency. They farmed, yes, but they also held rights, joined guilds, brought cases to court. They celebrated festivals with music and dance. They brewed ale, they married, they laughed. They rebelled when pushed too far. The peasants' revolt in England in 1381 was no random spasm of ignorance. It was organized, articulate, demanding justice in a language that echoed through the centuries. To imagine peasants only as silent, broken creatures is to erase their courage and their voices. And witches. Here lies one of the darkest myths of all. We think of the Middle Ages as an age of burning witches at every stake, women screaming in the night while the church fanned the flames. Yet widespread witch hunts came later in the early modern period in the 16th and 17th centuries. The medieval church was often skeptical of witchcraft, dismissing peasant charms as superstition rather than diabolical. Yes, there were trials, there were fears, but the frenzy of witch-burning belonged to later centuries when anxieties about religion and politics grew hotter. To brand the Middle Ages as one long witch hunt is to misplace the cruelty, giving it to the wrong age. Even torture devices carry myths sharper than their spikes. The Iron Maiden, that coffin of nails, is often paraded as a symbol of medieval brutality, yet it was never medieval at all. The Iron Maiden was a 19th century invention pieced together from older fragments and displayed in museums to shock visitors. The rack, the pair of anguish, the breaking wheel. Some of these were real, some exaggerated, some invented later. Torture did exist, of course, but it was not the daily spectacle we imagine, and many of the instruments we fear belong to the imagination of modern showmen, not to the jails of medieval Europe. Even the idea that life was short, that no one lived beyond 30, is a myth worth unraveling. The average life expectancy was low, yes, but that was because so many children died young. If you survived childhood, if you avoided plague and war, You could live to 50, 60, sometimes even more. Old age was not unknown in the Middle Ages. There were grandfathers and grandmothers, old monks bent with years, women who saw grandchildren born. Death was closer, more familiar. But life was not a brief flicker always cut short. It stretched as long as fortune allowed, and sometimes that was long indeed. One by one, the myths fall apart. Dirty, ignorant, joyless, superstitious, cruel. These are the words we use, but they do not hold. The Middle Ages were 1,000 years of change, of resilience, of color, of invention. They were human years, no darker and no brighter than any other age, but real in their complexity. And if we walk through their streets with open eyes, we see not caricatures, not shadows, but people, living, laughing, suffering, hoping, people not so unlike ourselves. So much of what we imagine is shaped not by the people who lived in those centuries, but by the centuries that came after. Renaissance scholars, eager to paint themselves as the torchbearers of enlightenment, spoke of the age before them as darkness. Enlightenment thinkers repeated the tale, proud of their reason against the supposed ignorance of the past. Victorians building museums full of torture devices and iron maidens, curated horror for an audience that loved to gasp. Even modern films, with their endless mud and gloom, keep the myth alive. Yet when we push aside these later inventions, the Middle Ages reveal themselves in shades far more intricate. It was not a single dark age, but 1,000 years of lives lived in light and shadow alike. Consider medicine. The easy myth tells us that medieval healers were fools, waving charms and bleeding patients until they died. And yes, bloodletting was common, humours were charted, astrology consulted. But medicine was not only superstition. Monastic infirmaries kept herbs growing in cloisters, their leaves pressed into poultices, their roots boiled into syrups. Garlic, sage, thyme, honey. These were not nonsense, but remedies with properties we still recognize today. Surgeons stitched wounds, set bones, and sometimes succeeded. Physicians studied Galen and Hippocrates, translated through Arabic scholars who preserved and expanded classical knowledge. The four humours may sound strange, but they were a framework, an attempt to understand balance in the body, a step, however flawed, toward the science to come. To dismiss medieval medicine as ignorant is to forget its persistence, its slow, patient experimentation. And knowledge itself, here lies another myth, that the Middle Ages destroyed the wisdom of antiquity, that books were burned, that libraries crumbled, and that only the Renaissance rescued thought from ruin. But in truth, the Middle Ages copied, translated, and guarded the works of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Euclid. Monks hunched over parchment in scriptoria, letters painstakingly traced, the flicker of candles leaving wax stains on pages that still survive. Without these hands, the wisdom we praise in the Renaissance would have vanished. Even more, the Middle Ages added their own voices. Scholastic debates in universities, treatises on optics, speculations on the motion of planets, theories of music and proportion. It was not a silence, but a conversation across centuries. Think, too, of art. Our myth imagines crude stick figures on manuscripts, flat icons without perspective. Yet look closer at an illuminated book, and the margins bloom with dragons, rabbits, faces half human and half beast. Gold leaf glitters, blues lapis deep, reds rich as blood. Cathedrals rose in stone, their arches pointing heavenward, their windows casting jewel light across stone floors. Music swelled from choirs, polyphony weaving voices in ways never heard before. It was not an artless age, but one overflowing with creativity, with experiments in color, line, sound, and form. Even war, often painted as endless chaos, was not the only rhythm of life. Knights clashed, yes, kings fought, but most people's lives beat to slower patterns. planting, harvesting, mending, marrying, birthing, burying. Wars punctuated but did not define the whole story. To imagine every day as sword against shield is to forget the plough, the loom, the oven. It is to forget that peace was the background, war the interruption. And then there is the myth of silence, that no one wrote their inner thoughts, that the medieval mind was alien to our own. Yet letters survive, tender and ordinary. A husband asking his wife to send wool, a merchant promising gifts to a child, a monk confessing doubt. Their voices, though written in ink that has faded, carry across centuries. They remind us that these people loved, worried, laughed, argued. They remind us that their humanity was not cloaked by the years. It was the same humanity we know. All these myths, so easily repeated, build an image of an age that never was, a world of dirt, ignorance, cruelty, silence. But the truth, once the myths are peeled away, is richer. It is a world where people bathed, studied, painted, built, healed, sang. It is a world where fear existed, but so did joy, where superstition lived alongside experiment, where hardship walked hand in hand with beauty. It is not a world of darkness, but of contrast, as bright as the stained glass of its cathedrals, as earthy as the smoke of its hearths. And so, as we wander through the corridors of history, the myths fall like dust shaken from beams. What remains is the hum of real life, once muffled by centuries of retelling, now rising clear. The Middle Ages do not need to be darkened to make the present shine brighter. They stand on their own, strange, vivid, and endlessly human. And what of the chastity belt, that iron cage we imagine locked around women's waists by jealous knights riding off to the Crusades? It is one of the most enduring images of medieval cruelty, yet it belongs not to the Middle Ages but to the imagination of later centuries. The belts displayed in museums, all iron and menace, were mostly made in the 19th century, crafted to titillate and horrify at the same time. The medieval world knew of chastity belts as a joke, a metaphor in poetry, a symbol in satire, not as an actual instrument clasped upon flesh. The real constraints on women's freedom were written in law and custom, not in steel. To picture women clanking miserably through stone halls is to fall for a myth conjured long after their time. Trials by ordeal hold another place in our imagination, the notion that guilt or innocence was decided by plunging a hand into boiling water, by swallowing poison, by sinking or floating in a river. It is true that ordeals were practiced, particularly in the early medieval centuries, but the myth lies in their brutality. They were not random tortures. They were rituals, framed by prayer, surrounded by belief that God would reveal truth. More often than not, priests guided the outcomes, declaring burns healed or wounds clean so that justice could align with community need. By the 13th century, the Church forbade ordeals altogether, and trials moved toward testimony, written evidence, juries. The image of endless barbaric ordeals misrepresents a practice that was already fading when the myths grew strongest. Armor and weapons, too, are wrapped in falsehoods. We imagine knights clanking like iron statues, unable to move, toppled helplessly if they fell from their horses. But real armor was balanced, crafted by smiths who understood weight and movement. A knight in full plate could run, mount a horse, wield his sword with agility. The armor was heavy, yes, but not immobilizing. It was protection for trained men who could fight long hours under its weight. And swords, those famous blades, were not crude bars of iron swung wildly. They were carefully forged, balanced to cut and thrust, designed for precision. To picture medieval warriors as stumbling brutes is to deny the craftsmanship and skill that defined their arms. Education, as we look closer, reveals another layer of truth. The myth says children were left in ignorance, that schools were rare and knowledge forbidden. But towns held grammar schools, monasteries taught boys their letters, and universities thrived. Even girls, though excluded from most formal study, learned at home or in convents, reading psalms, keeping accounts. Literacy was not universal, but it spread steadily, fed by the needs of trade, law, and devotion. The image of a Europe sunk in illiteracy is too simple. Knowledge grew, slow as ivy, persistent as grass, and the roots of modern learning laid deep in medieval soil. Hygiene, so often mocked, deserves another look. The myth insists people stank, that filth caked their skin, that lice crawled unchecked. Yet bathhouses were common, riversides were busy with washing, and linen shirts were changed often to keep bodies clean. Medieval manuals praised the virtues of washing hands before meals, of combing hair, of trimming nails. Herbs, scented water, tooth powders of sage or crushed shells freshened breath. True, sewage ran through streets, and not every village enjoyed clean wells, but the people knew it, complained about it, sought remedies. They did not glory in dirt. They battled it as best they could within the means of their time. And law, another space crowded with myths of cruelty, often leaned toward reconciliation. Compensation for wrongs, fines to repay, oaths sworn before witnesses. These were the common tools of justice. Death sentences were rare compared to our imagination. Communities preferred peace to endless cycles of blood. Even when gallows loomed, they were not the only instruments of order. The myth of perpetual savagery masks a reality where law evolved carefully, where courts became increasingly formal, where written records began to shape fairness. Step further into daily life and the myths fade still more. We imagine endless drudgery, mud floors, nothing but hunger and toil. But medieval people decorated their homes with carvings, painted walls with bright patterns, embroidered cloth with colors. They played music, danced in fields, told stories by firelight. They celebrated feast days with joy, fasted with solemnity, and marked the year with rhythms both sacred and merry. To live then was not to trudge through misery. It was to weave hardship and happiness together into a fabric of ordinary life. Even war, brutal as it was, did not mean every town smoldered. Many men never saw battle. Many women never heard a trumpet's call. Wars scarred regions, yes, but life continued around them, bread baked, children born, bells rung. The myth of constant chaos overlooks the endurance of peace, and so the myths crumble one by one. Chastity belts of iron, ordeals of cruelty, armor like coffins, peasants in despair, ignorance universal, filth unending. They are shadows, not truths. The real Middle Ages were messier, brighter, more human. They were not a caricature, but a living world of ingenuity and contradiction. Then there is the myth of the droit du seigneur, the so-called right of the first night, that lurid tale of lords bedding their vassals' brides on their wedding night. It appears again and again in novels, plays, and films, a ready symbol of medieval cruelty. Yet search the records, and you find only silence. No law grants it, no court case records it, no chronicler describes it as custom. It was a story whispered centuries later, born perhaps as satire, perhaps as propaganda, but not as practice. Lords held immense power, yes, and abuses of that power occurred, but the ritualized violation we imagine never stood as law. It is a myth that feeds our horror but starves on evidence. Universal serfdom is another shadow. We imagine every peasant bound to the soil, owned like cattle, unable to move. But the medieval landscape was patchwork. Some peasants were free, renting land or owning small plots. Others were bound by obligations but still held rights, could sue in courts, could buy freedom. Towns swelled with merchants and artisans, neither serf nor noble. The myth of universal slavery obscures the diversity of medieval society. where bonds existed, but so did pathways of escape and mobility. To call all peasants slaves is to flatten a world that was layered and shifting. And what of maps? We imagine medieval cartographers drawing seas teeming with monsters, edges marked, "Here be dragons." It is a compelling image, but it is not their reality. Medieval maps were not guides for travel, they were mirrors of belief. The famous Mappae Mundi placed Jerusalem at the center, rivers flowing from Eden, the world shaped more like a sermon than a compass. Yes, creatures prowled their margins, cynocephali with dog heads, men with faces in their chests. But they were not warnings so much as wonders, reminders of the vastness of creation. Dragons were rare, not scribbled across every sea. The myth of maps dripping with beasts was born of our fascination with the strange, not of the cartographer's intent. Constant famine is another myth, the idea that medieval people always starved. There were lean years, yes, when rains failed or winters bit hard. The great famine of the early 14th century killed many, and hunger was never far. But famine was not the permanent state. Medieval agriculture was resilient, fields tilled, rotations practiced, bread and ale produced year after year. Harvest festivals, markets bustling with produce, cellars stocked with ale. These were as much the reality as hunger. People remembered famine because it was exceptional, not because it was the daily bread. To paint the Middle Ages as one long starvation is to mistake memory of disaster for the texture of life. And cities, here lies a double myth. Some imagine them bustling with sophistication, others see them only as sewers of disease and crime. The truth lies between. Towns stank, yes, with waste and animals, but they also glittered with trade. Cloth from Flanders, spices from the East, books copied and sold, bells cast, glass blown, songs sung in taverns. Guilds regulated work, built hospitals, sponsored plays. Cathedrals rose in stone, markets bustled, children played in narrow lanes. To reduce medieval towns to filth alone is to miss their dynamism, their colour, their wealth of human exchange. Even the myth of silence at night deserves unravelling. We imagine darkness so thick it stifled, villages silent, fear crouching in every shadow. Yet medieval nights were alive with sound. Owls called, dogs barked, bells told the hours, watchmen called the time, festivals blazed with torches, processions wound through streets, songs rose from taverns. Darkness was feared, yes, but it was also filled with life, with rhythms different from the day. To imagine a silent, terrified medieval night is to forget the persistence of human voice, even in shadow. And so, piece by piece, the great edifice of myth collapses. The Middle Ages were not an age of unbroken cruelty, ignorance, dirt, and despair. They were an age of people, complicated as we are, fearing and hoping, laughing and grieving, building and breaking, weaving lives of hardship and joy. The myths simplify, the truth enriches. And when we strip away the myths, what remains is not a dark void, but a tapestry, flawed, vibrant, and unmistakably human. And then we come to perhaps the most stubborn myth of all, that medieval people believed the world was flat. It is a story told in classrooms, whispered in cartoons, repeated with a smirk. The idea that everyone in the so-called Dark Ages trembled at the thought of sailing too far for fear they would tumble off the edge. Yet it is a fiction. Medieval scholars, clerics, sailors, they knew the earth was round. They read Aristotle, they copied Ptolemy, they observed the curved shadow of the earth across the moon during an eclipse. No learned man doubted the sphere. Even sailors who needed no books could see how a ship's mast vanished last as it sank below the horizon. The flat earth myth was not theirs, but ours, a creation of the 19th century, invented to dramatize the supposed ignorance of the Middle Ages and to glorify the Enlightenment. In truth, medieval minds gazed upward and outward, not downward into imagined abysses. Another myth insists that most people never traveled, that peasants were chained to their villages, eyes never lifting beyond the next field. But people moved more than we imagine. Pilgrimages led them to shrines hundreds of miles away, from Canterbury to Compostela, from Rome to Jerusalem. Traders carried cloth, salt, furs, wine and spices across the continent. Journeys were slow, yes, but not impossible. A miller might walk to market towns, a craftsman might seek work in another city, a peasant's son might join a monastery far away. The roads were dusty and dangerous, but they were travelled, and Europe was stitched together by feet, hooves and sails. To imagine a continent of villagers who never saw beyond their parish is to forget the flow of movement that carried news, goods and ideas from shore to shore. And armor once more, we return to it, because the myth is heavy. We imagine men strapped in so tight that they could barely breathe, let alone fight, yet surviving suits tell another story. Articulated joints allowed knees to bend, shoulders to roll. A knight could mount his horse unaided, could run, could even vault into the saddle with ease. Accounts of tournaments describe warriors moving with grace, striking, parrying, grappling. The myth of crushing weight comes not from their time, but from ours, when rusted relics in museums were misunderstood, or imitations made too heavy for show. Real armor was deadly but not clumsy, and the men inside it were trained to move like dancers in steel. Perhaps the most persistent myth of all is that the church was an enemy of science, that priests stifled knowledge, silenced inquiry, punished curiosity. The truth is far more entangled. The medieval church built universities, sponsored scholars, preserved books, funded translations. Men like Roger Bacon, Albertus Magnus, and Thomas Aquinas were clerics who speculated on optics, nature, philosophy. The church did not fear knowledge. It sought to fit it into its vision of God's order. Conflict existed, yes, but the blanket image of suppression misrepresents a partnership as old as the cloisters where monks copied texts, and as new as the universities where theology sat beside law, medicine, and the arts. The myth of science shackled by faith blinds us to the reality that in the Middle Ages, faith and reason walked together more often than they fought. Even death, that looming shadow, is shaped by myth. We imagine people obsessed with mortality, dwelling only on skulls and graves. Yet the medieval ars moriendi, the art of dying well, was not about terror but about preparation, about meeting death with peace, about living so that the end came as completion, not as a theft. Graveyards were places of gathering, churches held not only funerals but feasts, and the dead were remembered not only with dread but with prayer and hope. To say medieval life was haunted only by fear of death is to miss the richness of how they lived alongside it. Step into their festivals, and another myth crumbles. The myth that joy was scarce. Carnival, May Day, midsummer fires, saints' days. The calendar was thick with celebration. Dances spun in village greens. Masks and costumes turned the world upside down. Laughter echoed in courts and cottages alike. Life was hard, yes, but it was not joyless. The people seized every chance to feast, to play, to forget the plough and the loom for a day. They did not live only in gloom. They wove colour into their days as surely as they wove thread into cloth. One by one the shadows lift, the flat earth vanishes, the locked chastity belts rust into nothing, the iron maiden retreats into museum lies, the peasant's chains loosen, the church's silence breaks into songs of study. What remains is a Middle Ages filled not with caricature but with humanity, flawed, striving, fearful, joyous, and endlessly curious. And then there is food, the steaming bowls and crusts we imagine thick with grime. A myth clings to the idea that medieval people gnawed rotten meat spiced only to disguise the stench, that they drank nothing but sour ale and chewed on blackened bread in smoky halls. Yet the tables of the Middle Ages, though unequal, were not barren. Peasants ate pottage, thick stews of grains and vegetables enlivened with onions, leeks, cabbages and beans. Bread came in many forms, from the coarse rye of the poor to the fine white loaves of the wealthy. Meat was eaten when it could be afforded, salted or smoked to preserve it, but rarely rotten, for spoiled food could kill, and they knew it well. Spices, when they arrived from far-off lands, were luxuries not for masking rot, but for flaunting wealth, for turning a dish into a performance. Feasts groaned with roasted swans, gilded pastries and sugared almonds. Even the poor found comfort in cheese, ale, apples and herbs gathered from hedgerows. The myth of endless rot blinds us to a cuisine that was rich with variety, tied to season and soil, and full of flavor, both humble and grand. Literacy, too, is misremembered. We are told that almost no one could read, that books were as rare as jewels, that only monks traced letters while the rest of Europe stumbled in darkness. Yet literacy was always more than books. Merchants scrawled tallies, craftsmen marked contracts, peasants signed their names with careful symbols. In towns, guilds kept records. In courts, clerks wrote down pleas. Women, especially in noble families and convents, learned to read psalters and prayers, sometimes even to write their own letters. Books were costly, yes, but not absent. By the 13th century, universities swelled with manuscripts copied not only by monks but by professional scribes, and students carried small volumes in satchels. To say no one read is to ignore the slow, steady spread of words across Europe, a spread that prepared the ground for the explosion of print. Violence is another shadow stretched too far. The myth insists medieval streets were chaos, blood running through gutters, men dueling at every turn. But the records show a more complex truth. Yes, brawls erupted, knives flashed, feuds flared. Yet law courts were busy, mediating, fining, seeking restitution. Town watches patrolled streets, bells tolled curfew, neighbors swore oaths to keep peace. Violence was present, but it was not the only tune. Markets bustled, children played, guilds sponsored plays, taverns rang with songs as often as with quarrels. To see only blood is to miss the texture of ordinary days, where most people rose in the morning, worked and returned home without the sound of steel. And what of women? Here the myths press hardest. We are told they were voiceless, powerless, hidden behind walls. Yet women spoke in courts, ran shops, brewed ale, tended land, healed with herbs, taught in convents. Queens ruled as regents, noble women managed estates, peasant wives bartered at markets. They were bound by custom and law, often hemmed in by male authority, but they were not absent. Their letters survive, their signatures appear, their choices ripple through chronicles. Even in romance the voices of women surface, singing of love, sorrow and wit. To paint them as silent shadows is to erase them twice, once in history and again in memory. So many myths cling to the Middle Ages because they satisfy something in us. They let us imagine progress as a clean climb from filth to light, from ignorance to reason, from chains to freedom. They give us villains to mock and victims to pity. But when we set them aside, we find not darkness but humanity, messy, flawed, striving, laughing, weeping, creating, destroying. The Middle Ages were not an age apart from us, sealed in shadow. They were another span of human time, bright and dim, ordinary and extraordinary.